In 2023, a scientist in a lab stared at a number on his screen and stopped typing. The genetic sequence in front of him didn't match Arabs. It didn't match the Iranians. It didn't match Turks, Indians, or Europeans. It didn't match any living human population on Earth. The skeleton was 4,500 years old, found buried in the mud near Uruk. The person it belonged to was alive at the exact moment the Sumerians invented writing. When someone pressed a reed into clay for the first time. When humans first learned to give each other names, and his DNA matched no one alive today. This is not a movie. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is peer-reviewed science, and it reopens the one question that 200 years of archaeology couldn't answer. Where did the Sumerians actually come from? And where did they go? What you're about to hear is what mainstream history never told you directly. Not because they were hiding it, but because the answer was so strange it didn't fit in a textbook. Every major ancient civilization has left a genetic trail. Egyptian bones have been found, Greek bones, Roman bones, Indus Valley bones. Their DNA has been read. Their stories have been reconstructed. But with the Sumerians, something strange happened. These people gave humanity writing. They built the first cities. They wrote the first legal code, 300 years before Hammurabi. They divided an hour into 60 minutes. They brewed beer and wrote down the recipe. They recorded the first named author in history, a woman. They wrote mythology that echoes through all three Abrahamic religions today. And then, they vanished. Not just the civilization. Not just the language. Not just the name. Their bodies vanished too. This is a scientific paradox so extreme that it genuinely seems impossible. We've decoded the DNA of Neanderthals from 40,000-year-old bone fragments in frozen European caves. We've decoded woolly mammoths. We've decoded a 700,000-year-old horse frozen in permafrost. But the people who were alive just 4,000 years ago, who lived in cities of 50,000 to 100,000 people, left us not a single complete readable genome. Why? Southern Mesopotamia, the part of Iraq where Sumer existed, is one of the worst places on Earth for ancient DNA survival. Summers reach 50 degrees Celsius. The moisture from the Tigris and Euphrates seeps into the soil. DNA needs cold to survive. It needs to be dry. It needs to be stable. Southern Iraq has none of those three. Bones are found, but they crumble when touched. DNA strands shatter into fragments too small and too damaged to reassemble. After a century of excavations in Mesopotamia, useful ancient DNA from this region is almost zero. The Sumerians left us more than almost any ancient people. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, creation myths, barley sale receipts, the foundations of temples, the names of kings. We can hear their voices echoing across 4,000 years, but their bodies have completely disappeared, as if an entire civilization became biologically invisible. We have their soul on clay, but not a single readable cell. So scientists did something unexpected. Instead of digging deeper, they looked around, and what they found was still walking, breathing, and living on that same land. If you can't read the bones of the Sumerians, can you read the DNA of their living descendants? In southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates merge before flowing into the Persian Gulf, a community has lived for thousands of years. The Marsh Arabs, the Madan. Their reed houses are built exactly as Sumerian art depicted 4,000 years ago, down to the same knots. Their boats are the same design, navigating the same channels. Their oral history traces back thousands of years without interruption. If anyone on Earth still carries a genetic echo of the Sumerians, it had to be them. In 2011, a research team from the University of Pavia, led by geneticist Nadia Al-Zahari, did something no one had done before. They sampled 143 Marsh Arab men, all with at least 4 verified generations of Marsh ancestry. They read both genetic lines. The Y chromosome is passed from a father to a son, and mitochondrial DNA is passed from the mother to all children. The maternal line returned what was expected. A normal Middle Eastern mix, but the paternal line made them look twice. 74% of those men carried the same single paternal line, J1P08. One line, 74%. In a normal population, paternal lines are a mosaic, dozens of lineages woven together. Here, it was almost a single thread, so concentrated that geneticists wrote, "This is one of the most homogeneous paternal groups ever recorded in the entire region." But the truly striking finding wasn't how concentrated it was. It was where it came from. To find where a lineage began, geneticists look for where it shows the greatest internal diversity, because a lineage accumulates the most variations where it has existed the longest. When they mapped J1P08, its center of gravity was not in southern Iraq. It was in the north, in upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Turkey, with faint rays spreading as far as Oman, the Ethiopian highlands, the eastern Mediterranean. The people considered closest to the Sumerians. Their dominant paternal line didn't originate where the Sumerians ended up. It looked like it had migrated in from the north, following the rivers down into the plains. The purely local origin story cracked right here. And a new question emerged, sharp as a blade. If this lineage came from the north, when exactly did it arrive? DNA doesn't just tell you where, it tells you when. Every generation, the Y chromosome accumulates small, predictable mutations. By counting how many have piled up and calculating backward, geneticists can estimate when a particular branch suddenly expanded, the moment a small group began to rapidly multiply and spread. When the Pavia team ran that clock on J1P08, the number that appeared was impossible to ignore. Approximately 4,500 years ago. Put that on the timeline of history. 4,500 years ago was exactly when Sumerian city-states, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, were at the absolute peak of their power. Cities with tens of thousands of residents packed behind walls. Ziggurats rising against the sky. Writing is fully matured. The first kings, the first armies, the exact moment when humanity first learned to live together on a massive scale. And at that very same moment, a single paternal line explosively expanded and spread across the plains. 2 events. 1 moment. The genetic imprint of the world's first urban revolution, written directly into DNA. You can feel the weight of that alignment, as if the birth of the city itself, with its population density, its accumulated wealth, its powerful men who left far more descendants than others, had literally printed itself onto the genome of that land. But here's the thing that most popular science videos won't tell you. That number is beautiful. Too beautiful. And numbers that beautiful are almost always overfit to a story. The 4,500-year date came with a margin of error of plus or minus 2,600 years. That expansion could have happened 7,000 years ago, long before any city existed, or just 2,000 years ago, long after Sumer had already collapsed. The error bar covers nearly all of Mesopotamian history, and the dating method itself, YSTR analysis, has long been considered unreliable by many geneticists. The moment Sumer was born in DNA sounds captivating, but it sits on a shakier foundation than it appears. Here's what makes this science more credible, not less. The scientists themselves said so. They didn't exaggerate. They stated the limitations plainly. In science, When researchers refuse to give the easy answer, that's when you have more reason to trust them. For years, the Sumerian genetic trail was a dead end. Then, in 2022, Iosif Lazaridis and his team at Harvard University did something that had seemed impossible. They decoded the first Neolithic genomes ever recovered from Mesopotamia. Not from southern Iraq. DNA doesn't survive there. But from the north, where conditions were slightly less harsh. And those genomes told a story that neither side in the debate had anticipated. For nearly 2 centuries, the debate had 2 sides. Side 1. The Sumerians were mysterious outsiders. They came from somewhere far away, perhaps a sunken land, perhaps Central Asia, perhaps somewhere no one had mapped. Side 2. The Sumerians were pure locals, direct descendants of the native Ubaid farmers who had cultivated southern Iraq since 6500 BCE. Lazaridis' data said both were wrong. The Neolithic people of northern Mesopotamia weren't a single uniform group standing still in one place. They were a mixture. A multi-source blend woven from at least 3 different ancestral lines. Hunter-gatherers from the Levant, from Anatolia, and most critically, a major stream from the east. From the Zagros Mountains, from what is now western Iran. Let that sink in, because it overturns the entire equation. Even the Ubaid culture, the group textbooks call the pure local root of the Sumerians, was itself already a mixture. It wasn't locally pure in the simple way people had imagined. Long before the first temples rose at Eridu, eastern blood from the mountains had already mixed into the population of the plains. What was considered the starting point was already the result of an encounter. And now here is the thing that genuinely raises the hair on the back of your neck. Sumerian mythology. For thousands of years, their ancient texts, over and over, point to a specific direction. East, toward a distant highland. That's where groundwater came from, they wrote. That's where metals came from. That's where the gods sent civilizations gifts from. For a century, scholars read those lines as poetry, religious metaphor, creative imagination. But now, the genetic data points east, toward the Zagros Mountains, the same direction. Is that mythology actually encoded memory? A record, preserved across hundreds of generations, of the place part of their bloodline had descended from? This is still speculation, not a proven conclusion, but it's a speculation that sends a shiver down the spine. Because perhaps those mountains were never metaphors. Perhaps they were memories. If the Sumerians were built from a mixture, where did that mixture go? Not in a museum, not underground. It's walking, it's breathing, it's alive. In Iraq's general population today, J1 is still present, around 31%. Alongside it, J2 at 24%, R1 lineages at roughly 21%, and a branch called T at 6.5%. These aren't just statistics. There are 4,000 years of Iraqi history, encoded in DNA. The Akkadian conquest, Amorites, Assyrians, Babylonians, then the Persians, Alexander's Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Ottoman Turks. Each wave deposited a new genetic layer. But one pattern genuinely stunned scientists. Those foreign lineages, J2, R1, lines that came from outside, they lean heavily toward the male side. About 30% of Iraqi Y chromosomes carry traces from distant regions. But in mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, that figure drops to just 9%, meaning conquerors and traders were mostly men. They came. They left descendants. But the native women, generation after generation, stayed rooted to that land. Their maternal lines preserved the ancient Mesopotamian core through century after century of invasion and change. The Marsh Arabs, Assyrians, Iraqi Jews, Mandeans, Different religions, different languages, but all sharing the same foundational bloodline underneath. Modern Iraqis are a diluted, enriched version of that same original melody. More instruments now, but the same tune. Place two puzzle pieces side by side. Piece 1. The Sumerian language is a complete isolate. No parents, no siblings, no descendants, not related to any language ever spoken on Earth, living or dead. If you only looked at language, you'd conclude the Sumerians were the most isolated, most unique people who ever existed. Piece 2. Their DNA says the exact opposite. Genetically, the Mesopotamians were not isolated at all. They continuously mixed and blended with the entire surrounding region, the Levant, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Zagros. Their blood was a connecting flow, not an island. A person can be utterly unique in how they spoke while being completely isolated in how they were born. Language and genes tell two different stories. Culture can be distinctive, while ancestry remains thoroughly mixed. A community can invent an entirely new way of speaking without needing to be a separate race. This is the twist that dismantles both 200-year-old theories simultaneously. The Sumerians were not mysterious outsiders who fell from the sky. They were also not a pure seed that sprouted in isolation from a single piece of land. They were a meeting point. The eastern flow from the Zagros poured down and mixed into the native population of the plains. And from that blending emerged something no single group could have produced on its own. Writing, cities, law, the wheel, the 60-minute hour. The first civilization of humankind was not the achievement of one race. It was the result of an encounter. Back to that 2023 skeleton near Uruk. The DNA matched no living population. This finding, if confirmed, opens one of three possibilities. First, DNA degradation distorted the results, entirely possible in southern Iraq's climate. The molecule was so damaged that it no longer resembled what it originally was. Second, this individual was from an isolated genetic pocket, a community that had remained separate from surrounding populations long enough to diverge noticeably. Third, and this is the most uncomfortable possibility, the Sumerians carried an ancestral component that has since been completely diluted, one that is no longer detectably present in any living population. Not extinct because the people died. Extinct because they mixed so completely, so thoroughly, over so many centuries that this specific genetic signature dissolved. Like a color mixed into paint until you can no longer see it separately, even though it's still there, part of everything. Science says, honestly, we don't know. Not yet. Because the real answer is buried, where science hasn't reached. Beneath the cities of southern Mesopotamia, beneath Eridu, beneath Uruk, beneath Ur, are the genomes that could actually settle this question. But those sites sit under modern cities, or in regions made inaccessible by decades of war, or behind excavation permits that have been in bureaucratic limbo for years. Climate, war, and bureaucracy, history's three worst enemies, are working together. The work continues slowly, quietly, without headlines, one footnote, one paragraph at a time, until one day we notice the textbook has quietly become different. For 200 years, we were asking the wrong question. Where did the Sumerians come from? As if there had to be one place, one homeland, one pin on a map. The data says the right question was always, how were the Sumerians made? Not one origin, a mixture. And this isn't only true for the Sumerians. Egyptians weren't pure. Greeks weren't pure. Romans weren't pure. Chinese weren't pure. No people who ever called themselves a people were ever a pure, unbroken block. All were layers of older people stacked over thousands of years of movement and blending. The Sumerians are just an especially clear example, because they invented writing, and through it they told their story to us. And now, for the first time in the language of DNA, that story is starting to match. Think about the person in that skeleton for a moment, the one whose DNA matched no one alive. He woke up one morning 4,500 years ago. He ate something. He spoke to someone, a language no living person can speak. Maybe he pressed a reed into clay. Maybe he was a farmer. Maybe he was a priest. Maybe he was a child. We don't know. We only know that the tiny fragments of his genome that survived, they belong to a world that no longer exists in any recognizable form. A world that became everything we are today, but left no visible trace of itself behind. The Sumerians didn't die. They just forgot their name. The empire fell. The language died. The temples were buried. The name Sumer faded from living mouths until no one called themselves by it anymore. But the blood didn't vanish with the name. It stayed, in the people still building reed houses in the marshes, in the Assyrians who preserved ancient faiths, in millions of Iraqis walking that same land today, in whose veins the core of those first people still quietly echoes. As long as people are living between the two rivers, the Sumerians, in a very real sense, are still there. If this settled something in your head, or unsettled it, drop one word in the comments. Still here, and I want to ask you something genuinely. Do you think that Sumerian mythology pointing east toward the Zagros Mountains was encoded ancestral memory, or just religious poetry? Because scientists are actually divided on this. I'd love to know where you land. And if you want to be one of the first people to know the next time ancient DNA rewrites something we thought we knew for certain, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel does. The next video, another ancient mystery, another genome, another answer that raises more questions than it solves. Don't miss it. There's something ancient DNA research does that most people don't talk about. It starts as statistics. Populations, percentages, haplogroups, error bars. Cold, precise, impersonal. The language of science is doing what science does, and then, occasionally, it gets uncomfortably close to a single human being. That skeleton near Uruk, the one whose DNA matched no living population. He had a mother. He had a childhood. He lived through seasons. The flooding of the Tigris, the dry heat of summer, the brief cool of winter mornings. He had a name that someone called him by every day, in a language that no longer exists in any living mouth. And now he's a data point that doesn't fit the model. There is something genuinely strange about that. Science is trying to figure out where he came from, what population he belonged to, and what percentage of his genome overlaps with modern populations. But the question science can't answer is the one that actually matters as a human being. Who was he? Ancient DNA forces that question, not by answering it, but by making it impossible to ignore. Every genome recovered from the ancient world is a person who never expected to be analyzed, who never imagined that thousands of years later the chemistry inside their bones would be extracted and compared against a database of 7 billion living people. And in the Sumerian case, it matched none of them. That's either a scientific anomaly to be explained away, or it's a small window into a world so thoroughly transformed by time that we can't recognize it anymore. Either way, it's worth sitting with for a moment. One more dimension that rarely makes it into the popular discussion. When geneticists map the genetic structure of the Iraqi population, the ancient Mesopotamian core, the later conquest layers, the asymmetry between maternal and paternal lines, they're not only writing history, they're generating medical knowledge. Genetic differences between populations affect how the body metabolizes medicine. They affect disease risk profiles. They affect safe dosage calculations. Understanding the actual genetic structure of Iraqis, the Sumerian-era foundation, the lineages added by centuries of conquest, the maternal versus paternal distribution, helps researchers design better treatments, predict inherited disease risk more accurately, and build drug protocols better matched to the population's real genetic makeup. The mirror that reflects the Sumerians also reflects living patients. That ancient skeleton, that genome that matched no one. It's one piece of a larger picture in which the past and the present are quite literally healing each other. The question, where did the Sumerians come from, turns out to have consequences far beyond any history book.